Sometimes the greatest gift comes wrapped in our deepest fears. Sometimes salvation appears in the form we least expect. Three sisters, Marion, Cecily, and Elinor, arrive at a snow-covered manor where Lord Thorne, an ancient vampire, makes them an impossible offer. Marion has lost her husband and drowns in grief. Cecily has sacrificed everything for others and feels empty inside. Elinor is trapped in a marriage that slowly kills her spirit. Their dying aunt brought them here not as prey, but as companions for eternity. Lord Thorne no longer hunts for blood. He searches for something far more precious people to share forever with. As the winter storm rages outside, each sister faces a choice that will change everything. He offers them immortality, safety, and a family bond that could last centuries. But when someone offers you forever, what must you give up in return? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The carriage wheels crunched through the deepening snow as three women huddled beneath heavy woolen blankets, their breath forming small clouds in the frigid air. Outside, the wind howled through ancient pines that stood like silent sentinels along the narrow mountain path. Inside the cramped confines, Marion Whitmore pressed her fingers against the simple gold band on her left hand, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing in the 2 years since Thomas had died. She was 43 now, though grief had carved lines around her eyes that made her appear older in certain light. Her auburn hair, once Thomas's pride, had begun showing threads of silver at the temples. She wore it pulled back severely, as if beauty itself were an affront to mourning. The wedding ring caught what little light filtered through the carriage window, and she twisted it absently while watching the endless procession of snow-laden trees. Across from her sat Cecily, the eldest at 47, her hands folded primly in her lap. Where Marion had grown gaunt with sorrow, Cecily had taken on the sturdy build of a woman accustomed to lifting others literally and figuratively. For 20 years, she had cared for their ailing parents, then their uncle, then a succession of elderly neighbors who had no one else. Her brown hair was completely grey now, though she was too practical to mind such vanities. Her blue eyes held a weariness that spoke of countless sleepless nights spent at bedsides, countless meals prepared for others, while she ate the remnants standing in kitchens that were never quite her own. Elinor, the youngest at 39, sat pressed against the far corner of the carriage as if trying to disappear entirely. Beneath her travelling cloak, Marion could see the careful way she held her left arm, a tenderness that spoke of recent injury. Her blonde hair was still beautiful, but she wore it in a style that concealed much of her face. When she did speak, which was rarely, her voice carried the measured cadence of someone who had learned to weigh each word for potential consequences. Between them, taking up far more space than her diminutive frame should have allowed, lay their Aunt Cordelia. At 71, she appeared frailer with each laboured breath, her once commanding presence reduced to intermittent whispers and long stretches of troubled sleep. The journey from London had already taken 3 days longer than planned, and with each mile deeper into the remote highlands of Scotland, her condition seemed to worsen. "Tell me again why we're travelling to this god-forsaken place in the middle of winter," Elinor said, her voice barely audible above the wind. She touched her left cheek unconsciously, another gesture that had become habitual since her marriage to Edmund Ashworth 5 years prior. Cecily leaned forward, adjusting the blanket around their aunt's shoulders. With practiced gentleness, Aunt Cordelia insisted. She said, "Lord Thorne was an old friend who could help us." She paused, studying their aunt's peaceful face. "She's been quite adamant about it, even in her delirium," Marion continued, twisting her ring. "What kind of man chooses to live in such isolation? We've passed no villages for hours, no signs of civilization at all." "Perhaps that's exactly why he chooses it," Cecily replied, with the wisdom of someone who had often wished for escape herself. "Some people find peace away from the world's demands. The carriage hit a particularly deep rut, jolting all three women. Aunt Cordelia's eyes fluttered open, their once bright green, now clouded with illness and medication. She seemed to look right through them for a moment before her gaze focused on Marion's face. "My dear child," she whispered, her voice paper-thin, "you're still wearing it." Marion instinctively covered the wedding ring with her other hand. "It feels wrong to take it off. Thomas wouldn't want you to stop living because of a piece of gold," Cordelia said with surprising clarity. "Love isn't diminished by loving again. It's multiplied." Before Marion could respond, their aunt's attention shifted to Cecily. "And you, sweet Cecily, when did you last do something purely for your own happiness?" Cecily's practical expression softened into confusion. "I find happiness in helping others." "That's not what I asked." Cordelia's hand emerged from beneath the blankets to touch Cecily's cheek with surprising tenderness. "You've spent your entire adult life in service to others. What do you want for yourself?" The question seemed to catch Cecily completely off guard. She opened her mouth to respond, then closed it again, as if the concept of personal desires had become foreign to her. Finally, Cordelia's gaze settled on Elinor, and her expression grew troubled. "Child, show me your arm." Elinor instinctively pulled her cloak tighter. "It's nothing. I fell." "Show me." There was steel beneath the weakness in Cordelia's voice, an echo of the formidable woman she had once been. Reluctantly, Elinor rolled back her sleeve to reveal finger-shaped bruises in various stages of healing along her forearm. The silence in the carriage became deafening. "How long?" Cordelia asked quietly. "It's not what you think," Elinor began, but her aunt's knowing look stopped her. "How long has Edmund been hurting you?" The words hung in the air like an accusation. Marion and Cecily stared at their younger sister, seeing clearly for the first time the careful way she moved, the calculated responses, the fear that lurked behind her eyes. "He doesn't mean to," Elinor said finally. "He has such pressure from his business, and sometimes he drinks, and I know exactly what to say to set him off. So really, it's—" "Stop." Cordelia's voice cut through the explanation with surprising strength. "Listen to yourself, child. You're making excuses for a man who bruises your body and breaks your spirit." Elinor began to cry, then not the delicate tears of a lady, but the deep, wrenching sobs of someone who had held pain inside for too long. Cecily immediately moved to comfort her, wrapping strong arms around her sister's shaking form. Marion felt something crack open in her chest, a mixture of rage and protective love she hadn't experienced since losing Thomas. "We're not taking you back to him." "But where can I go?" Elinor's voice was muffled against Cecily's shoulder. "I have no money of my own, no skills, no—" "You'll figure it out," Cordelia interrupted, her breathing becoming more labored. "All of you will. Lord Thorne will help you see possibilities you never imagined." The carriage began to slow, and through the window they could see the outline of an enormous structure emerging from the swirling snow. Thorne Manor rose from the landscape like something out of a medieval dream or nightmare. Massive stone walls climbed toward battlements that disappeared into the low-hanging clouds. Towers twisted skyward at impossible angles, their windows glowing with warm, amber light that seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. "Dear God," Marion breathed. "It's like something from another century." "Several centuries, actually," Cordelia murmured, and there was something almost like anticipation in her voice. "Lord Thorne appreciates things that endure." The carriage finally stopped before an enormous iron gate that stood open despite the storm. Beyond it, a circular drive led to massive wooden doors that could have accommodated a small army. As they watched, the doors opened, and a tall figure emerged into the snow. Even from a distance, Lord Thorne commanded attention. He moved through the blizzard as if the wind and snow were merely suggestions rather than natural forces. His dark coat billowed behind him, and his stride suggested both power and infinite patience. As he approached their carriage, Marion caught a glimpse of his face in the lamplight, sharp cheekbones, eyes the colour of storm clouds, and an expression of such profound weariness that it took her breath away. He opened the carriage door himself, seemingly oblivious to the snow that immediately began accumulating on his dark hair. "Lady Cordelia," he said, and his voice carried the weight of mountains. "You should have sent word you were coming. Would you have refused me?" Cordelia asked with a weak smile. "Never." The simple word carried absolute truth. "But I would have prepared better accommodations for your comfort." He helped Cordelia from the carriage with a gentleness that belied his imposing presence, then turned to assist the three sisters. When his hand touched Marion's, she felt a jolt of something she couldn't name. Not attraction exactly, but recognition, as if some dormant part of her soul had suddenly awakened. His eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw centuries reflected there. Not metaphorically, but literally, as if she were looking into the eyes of someone who had watched empires rise and fall, who had loved and lost more times than any mortal heart should bear. "Welcome to Thorne Manor," he said simply, but the words felt like a benediction. As they hurried through the snow toward the massive doors, Marion found herself walking beside him. "Lord Thorne," she began, then stopped, unsure what she had intended to say. He glanced at her, and she saw a flicker of something surprise. Hope? Yes, Mrs. Whitmore? The use of her name startled her until she remembered that Cordelia would have told him about them. But there was something in the way he said it, as if her name held particular significance. "Nothing," she said finally. "Thank you for taking us in during such weather." "The storm will last several days," he replied matter-of-factly. "Perhaps longer. I hope you'll find your stay comfortable." As they crossed the threshold into the manor, Marion felt as though she were stepping across more than just a doorway. The interior was breathtaking, soaring ceilings supported by carved stone pillars, tapestries that seemed to shimmer in the firelight, and a sense of timeless grandeur that made their London townhouse seem cramped and ordinary by comparison. Servants appeared as if from nowhere to take their coats and bags. They moved with practiced efficiency, but spoke little, and Marion noticed that they all shared the same peculiar trait eyes that seemed far too old for their faces. "Mrs. Hawthorne will show you to your rooms," Lord Thorne said, indicating a severe-looking woman who had appeared at his shoulder. "Dinner will be served in 1 hour, if you feel up to joining me. If not, meals can be brought to your chambers." Cordelia, who had been leaning heavily on Cecily's arm, straightened with visible effort. "We'll join you, Victor. There are things we need to discuss." The use of his first name seemed to surprise the sisters, but Lord Thorne merely nodded. "Of course. Mrs. Hawthorne will see that you have everything you need." As they were led up a magnificent stone staircase, Marion found herself looking back. Lord Thorne stood in the great hall, watching them ascend, and for a moment the weariness in his expression was replaced by something that looked almost like hope. She twisted her wedding ring again, but for the first time in 2 years, the gesture brought comfort rather than pain. Something was beginning here. She could feel it in the ancient stones of the manor, in the way the firelight seemed to reach toward them like welcoming arms, in the impossible depth of Lord Thorne's storm-coloured eyes. Whatever her aunt had brought them here to discover, Marion suspected their lives were about to change in ways none of them could imagine. The dining hall of Thorne Manor stretched before them like a cathedral of carved stone and flickering candlelight. A massive table dominated the centre, set for 5, with a silver that gleamed like captured starlight. Above them, a chandelier held dozens of candles that cast dancing shadows across tapestries depicting scenes from centuries past. Lord Thorne had changed for dinner into formal evening wear that somehow made him appear even more imposing. He moved with fluid grace as he helped Aunt Cordelia to her chair, his attention focused entirely on her comfort despite the obvious effort it cost her to remain upright. Marion found herself seated to his right, with Cecily and Elinor positioned across from them. The arrangement felt deliberately intimate, as if they were family gathering for a private meal rather than strangers sheltering from a storm. "The wine is from my own vineyard," Lord Thorne said, lifting an ornate silver goblet that seemed to capture and hold the candlelight in its etched surface. The chalice was clearly ancient, its sides covered in symbols that looked far older than any language Marion recognized. The grapes have grown on this land for over 3 centuries. As he poured wine into similar goblets for each of them, Marion noticed how his hands moved with the precision of someone who had performed this ritual countless times. The wine itself was deep red, almost black in the candlelight, and when she tasted it, the flavor was unlike anything she had experienced, rich and complex, with an underlying sweetness that seemed to warm her from within. "This is extraordinary," Cecily said, her usual reserve softened by surprise. "I've never tasted anything like it. Time has a way of improving certain things," Lord Thorne replied, and Marion caught something in his tone that suggested he wasn't speaking only of wine. Aunt Cordelia had barely touched her food, but she watched their host with sharp attention. "Victor, they need to know. Cordelia, they need to know what you're offering them and what it means." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had spent a lifetime managing difficult situations. "These women have come here carrying more pain than any soul should bear. They deserve honesty." Lord Thorne set down his goblet with careful deliberation. In the candlelight, Marion could see how his jaw tightened, as if he were preparing himself for something difficult. "What exactly are we talking about?" Marion asked, though something deep in her chest had begun to flutter with anticipation rather than fear. "Tell them about the goblet first," Cordelia said quietly. Lord Thorne's fingers traced the ancient symbols on the silver surface. "This belonged to my father and his father before him, back through a lineage that spans more years than most histories record." He paused, studying their faces. "The symbols represent a family crest, but also something more. They mark those who have chosen to step outside the normal flow of mortal time." Elinor leaned forward, her bruised arm forgotten in her curiosity. "What do you mean?" "I mean that I am older than I appear. Considerably older." His storm-grey eyes met each of theirs in turn. "I was born in the year 1247. The silence that followed was absolute, except for the crackling of logs in the enormous fireplace. Marion felt as if the world had tilted slightly off its axis, though some part of her, the part that had recognized something ancient in his eyes, wasn't entirely surprised. Cecily was the first to speak. "That would make you 778 years old, yes." He lifted the goblet again, studying its surface as if reading a familiar text. "I know how it sounds. I know what your rational minds are telling you right now. But your hearts already suspect the truth, don't they?" Marion found that they did. The impossible depth in his eyes, the way he moved through the blizzard as if weather held no power over him, the servants who seemed to exist outside normal time. It all made a terrible, wonderful kind of sense. "How?" Elinor whispered. "I was changed when I was 35 years old," Lord Thorne said simply, "by a creature that humanity has given many names throughout history. Vampire is perhaps the most accurate, though it carries associations that don't reflect the reality of what I've become." He set the goblet down and leaned back in his chair, and Marion realized he was giving them space to process, to react, to flee if they chose to. "You're telling us you're a vampire?" Cecily said, her practical nature demanding clarity even in the face of impossibility. "I am telling you that I no longer age as mortal humans do, that I require blood to sustain my existence, and that I possess certain abilities that transcend normal human limitations." His voice was steady, matter of fact. I am also telling you that despite what folklore might suggest, I retain my humanity, my capacity for love, my moral choices. I am not a monster, though I have had centuries to become one if I had chosen that path. Marion surprised herself by asking, "Why haven't you?" A smile touched the corners of his mouth, the first genuine expression of warmth she had seen from him. "Because isolation is not the same as emptiness, and immortality without connection is merely an elaborate form of death." "What does this have to do with us?" Elinor asked, though Marion suspected they all knew the answer. Lord Thorne stood and walked to one of the tall windows that looked out onto the storm. Snow continued to fall in thick sheets, and the wind rattled the ancient glass. "For 7 centuries, I have lived alone in this manor. I have watched empires rise and fall, seen plagues sweep across continents, witnessed the birth and death of countless generations." He turned back to them, and the loneliness in his expression was so profound that Marion felt her heart clench. "I have loved mortal women, and I have buried them. I have made companions of my kind, and I have watched them succumb to the madness that often accompanies infinite time." "Aunt," Cordelia spoke into the silence, "tell them what you want, Victor. I want what every soul wants, mortal or immortal. I want family, I want connection. I want to share the weight of existence with others who understand both its beauty and its burden." He returned to the table, his attention focused entirely on the 3 sisters. "I am offering you the choice to join me in immortality." The words hung in the air like an incantation. Marion felt her wedding ring against her finger, suddenly aware of its weight in a way she hadn't been since Thomas died. "All of us?" Cecily asked. "All of you, if you choose it. The transformation is not something that should be undertaken lightly or alone. You are sisters, bound by blood and history and love. That bond would only strengthen in immortality." Elinor's hand went automatically to her bruised arm. "What would we become?" "Yourselves, but freed from the constraints of mortal time. You would retain your personalities, your memories, your capacity for growth and change. You would simply have eternity to explore what those things might become." "And the cost?" Marion asked. "Because there was always a cost. You would need to feed, as I do, though not in the manner that Gothic novels might suggest. You would outlive everyone you have ever known who chooses to remain mortal. You would carry the weight of centuries, with all the joy and sorrow that implies." He paused. "And you would be bound to this place, and to me, in ways that would make separation difficult, if not impossible." "A prison," Elinor said quietly. "Or a sanctuary," Cecily countered, and Marion realized her practical sister was seriously considering the offer. Lord Thorne lifted his ancient goblet once more. "I have lived 7 centuries, waiting for souls who might understand what I'm offering. Not transformation for its own sake, but the chance to build something lasting, to create a family that time cannot destroy." Marion looked around the table at her aunt, who watched with knowing eyes, at Cecily, whose expression suggested she was already weighing the possibilities, at Elinor, who for the first time in years looked as if she might dare to hope for something better. "How long do we have to decide?" Marion heard herself ask. "The storm will last at least a week," Lord Thorne replied. "Take whatever time you need, but understand that this offer comes without pressure and without consequence if you choose to refuse it. I will not trap you here through manipulation or force." As if summoned by his words, thunder rolled across the mountains and the lights flickered. Outside, the blizzard continued its relentless assault on the ancient stones of the manor. Marion twisted her wedding ring again, but for the first time since Thomas died, she found herself wondering what lay beyond grief, beyond the familiar weight of loss. Lord Thorne was offering them forever, but forever built on connection rather than solitude, on love shared rather than love lost. The goblet gleamed in the candlelight, its ancient symbols seeming to pulse with possibility. The chambers Lord Thorne had provided were more luxurious than anything the sisters had experienced in their modest London lives. Marion's room overlooked the snow-covered gardens through tall windows framed in heavy velvet drapes. A fire crackled in an ornate fireplace, casting warm light across Persian rugs and furniture that belonged in a museum. But luxury could not quiet the storm of thoughts that kept her awake long past midnight. She sat in a wing-back chair near the fire, still wearing her dinner dress, turning her wedding ring in endless circles around her finger. The conversation in the dining hall felt like a dream, or perhaps everything before it had been the dream, and she was only now awakening to reality. A soft knock at her door interrupted her reverie. "Come in," she called, expecting perhaps Mrs. Hawthorne with late-night tea. Instead, Lord Thorne entered, carrying a silver tray with 2 cups and a pot that smelled of chamomile and honey. He had changed from his formal dinner attire into a simple white shirt and dark trousers, somehow managing to appear both more approachable and more dangerous. "I thought you might be unable to sleep," he said, setting the tray on a small table near her chair. "May I?" Marion nodded toward the chair opposite hers. As he poured tea for both of them, she studied his profile in the firelight. Without the formal clothes and candlelit atmosphere, she could see him more clearly, the strong line of his jaw, the slight curl to his dark hair, the way his hands moved with centuries of practiced grace. "What was your wife like?" she asked suddenly, then felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm sorry. I assumed I've been married 3 times, he said quietly, handing her a delicate porcelain cup. "The first was arranged by my father when I was still mortal. The second and third were love. Matches, decades apart." He settled into his chair, his own cup cradled in both hands. "They all died of old age, while I remained unchanged." The simple words carried such profound sadness that Marion felt her chest tighten. That must have been unbearable. "It was the price I chose to pay for loving mortals while being immortal myself." His grey eyes met hers across the small space between them. "But I found that love shared, even temporarily, was preferable to love avoided entirely." Marion sipped her tea, feeling the warmth spread through her body. "Thomas, my husband, he died so suddenly. A heart attack at 41. No warning, no chance to say goodbye." She stared into the fire. "I keep thinking if I had one more day, one more conversation, I could have told him all the things I never found time to say." "What would you have told him?" The question caught her off guard. She had spent 2 years cataloguing her regrets, but no one had ever asked her to voice them aloud. "That he made me feel beautiful every single day, that his laugh could chase away any sadness, that I never thanked him properly for the way he brought me tea every morning, or how he always warmed my side of the bed before I got in." Tears began to slide down her cheeks. "That loving him was the best thing I ever did, and I'm terrified I'll never feel that way again." Lord Thorne leaned forward slightly. "Do you believe love is a finite resource?" "What do you mean? Do you believe that because you love Thomas completely, you have no love left to give? Or do you think perhaps love is more like a flame, diminished not by sharing, but by withering in isolation?" Marion looked down at her wedding ring, its simple gold surface reflecting the firelight. "I don't know how to stop feeling guilty for even considering it." "Thomas wouldn't want you to carry guilt as a monument to his memory," Lord Thorne said gently. "From what little I knew of him through Cordelia's letters, yes, she has written to me about all of you over the years. He was a man who chose joy whenever possible." The revelation that her aunt had been corresponding with Lord Thorne raised new questions, but Marion found herself more curious about something else. "You said, love shared is preferable to love avoided. Do you still believe that, knowing the pain it brings?" "More than ever." His voice carried absolute conviction. 700 years have taught me that connection is what makes existence meaningful, whether that existence lasts 70 years or 7,000. A comfortable silence settled between them. broken only by the crackling fire and the wind outside. Marion realized that for the first time since Thomas died, she wasn't actively fighting against hope. Meanwhile, 3 doors down the corridor, Cecily sat on the edge of her bed with her worn leather Bible open in her lap. The book had been her mother's, and her grandmother's before that, its pages soft from decades of handling. She had carried it through every crisis, found comfort in its familiar verses during the darkest nights of caring for dying relatives. Now, she stared at the words without reading them, her mind wrestling with questions that Sunday sermons had never addressed. The leather cover was cracked along the spine, and several pages had come loose over the years, but she had never been able to bring herself to replace it. Like her faith itself, it was imperfect but deeply cherished. A soft knock interrupted her meditation. "Cecily? It's Elinor. May I come in?" Her youngest sister entered wearing a white nightgown that made her look younger and more vulnerable than her 39 years. The bruises on her arm were more visible in the soft light, purple and yellow marks that told a story Cecily wished she had recognized sooner. "I can't sleep," Elinor said, settling into the chair by Cecily's fireplace. "Every time I close my eyes, I keep thinking about what he offered us." Cecily closed the Bible carefully, her thumb marking the page she hadn't been reading. "What part troubles you most?" "The part where it might actually be possible to be happy." Elinor's voice broke slightly. "I know that sounds foolish, but I've been trapped for so long that freedom feels more frightening than familiar misery." "It doesn't sound foolish at all." Cecily joined her sister by the fire, still holding the Bible. "I've been thinking about what he asked me at dinner, about what you want for yourself. I realized I couldn't answer because I've never allowed myself to want anything that wasn't connected to someone else's needs." Cecily ran her fingers over the Bible's worn cover. "Even my faith has been about service, caring for the sick, comforting the dying, sacrificing my own desires for what I believed was God's will." Elinor studied her sister's face. "And now I'm wondering if God's will might include my happiness too, if perhaps I've been so focused on carrying others' burdens that I've forgotten I'm allowed to set them down occasionally." "What does the Bible say about vampires?" Elinor asked, with a weak smile. Cecily laughed, a sound that surprised them both. "Nothing helpful, I'm afraid, though it has quite a lot to say about love, sacrifice, and choosing hope over fear." They sat in comfortable silence, 2 sisters who had spent their lives defining themselves through others' needs, contemplating the revolutionary idea that they might be worthy of consideration in their own right. "Cecily," Elinor said finally, "if we did this, if we chose immortality, do you think we'd still be ourselves?" Cecily opened her Bible to a passage she had marked years ago, her finger finding the familiar verse. The verse says, "And now these 3 remain, faith, hope, and love. But the greatest of these is love." She looked at her sister. "I think, as long as we hold on to love for each other, for him, for the possibility of building something beautiful, will remain who we're meant to be." Outside their windows, the storm continued its assault on the ancient manor, but inside, something was beginning to shift. 3 women who had defined themselves by loss were slowly opening to the possibility of gain. The second day at Thorne Manor dawned grey and cold, with snow still falling in steady sheets that showed no signs of abating. Marion woke to find that someone had built up her fire during the night and left a breakfast tray by her bedside, fresh bread still warm from the oven, honey that tasted of wildflowers, and tea that seemed to carry hints of herbs she couldn't identify. She dressed carefully in one of the gowns that had mysteriously appeared in her wardrobe, a deep blue wool that fit her perfectly despite no one having taken measurements. As she made her way downstairs, she wondered how Lord Thorne had known her size, then decided some mysteries were less important than others. The manor felt different in daylight, no less imposing, but somehow more welcoming. Portraits lined the corridors, faces from different centuries, all sharing the same timeless quality. She paused, before one painting that showed a woman with kind eyes and greying hair, dressed in the fashion of perhaps 50 years past. "Elinor," Lord Thorne's voice came from behind her. "My second wife." Marion turned to find him approaching with that fluid grace she was beginning to recognize. In the morning light streaming through tall windows, he appeared more human somehow, though the ancient wisdom in his eyes remained unchanged. "She was beautiful," Marion said, studying the painted face. "She was magnificent. A doctor when few women were permitted such aspirations, a mother to orphaned children, a woman who saw possibility where others saw only problems." His expression grew distant. "She lived to be 83, which was remarkable for her era. I had 37 years with her. 37 years of watching her age while you remained the same. 37 years of learning that love makes even certain heartbreak worthwhile." He gestured toward the breakfast room. "Would you join me? I thought we might discuss more practical matters today." The breakfast room was smaller and more intimate than the formal dining hall, with windows that overlooked a snow-covered garden. Cecily and Elinor were already seated at a round table, both looking more rested than Marion felt. "I've been thinking about your questions from last night," Lord Thorne said as he poured coffee from a silver service. "About the practical aspects of what I'm offering." Cecily looked up from buttering a piece of toast. "Such as?" "The transformation itself, for one. It's not the violent, traumatic process that folklore suggests. More like a deep sleep that lasts 3 days, during which your body gradually adapts to its new nature." Elinor set down her cup with careful precision. "And after, what would our lives look like?" "Much as they do now in many ways. You would still need food, though less of it. You would still sleep, though not as much. You would retain all your memories, your personalities, your capacity for growth and change." He paused, studying their faces. "The primary differences would be in your physical capabilities and your relationship with time." "You mentioned feeding," Marion said quietly. "Blood is necessary, yes, but not in the manner you might imagine. A few drops taken willingly from donors who understand what they're offering. I have arrangements with several families in the nearby villages, people I've helped over the centuries who consider it an honor to assist me." The explanation was so matter-of-fact that Marion found her fears beginning to ease. "And we would live here? In the manor? This would be your home, though you wouldn't be prisoners. The world has much to offer, and immortality provides time to explore it thoroughly." His smile held genuine warmth. "I confess, I've often wondered what it would be like to share my travels with companions who could appreciate both the beauty and the irony of watching history unfold." Elinor had been quiet during this exchange, but now she spoke up. "What about Edmund? My husband?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Lord Thorne's expression grew cold in a way that reminded them all that he was far more than he appeared. "Your husband will be informed that you perished in the blizzard," he said simply, "along with your sisters and aunt. A tragic accident, but these mountain storms can be treacherous. You would fake our deaths. I would give you the chance to be reborn without the chains that bind you to lives that bring you pain." Marion watched her youngest sister's face as she processed this. Elinor's hand went unconsciously to her arm, where the bruises had begun to fade from purple to yellow-green. "Could you help me tend to those?" Marion asked, gently, nodding toward Elinor's arm. "I have some experience with healing." Elinor hesitated, then nodded. They excused themselves to Marion's chambers, where the fire had been built up again, and afternoon light streamed through the tall windows. "Let me see," Marion said softly. Elinor rolled up her sleeves to reveal not just the finger-shaped bruises they had glimpsed in the carriage, but a map of violence written across her skin. Some marks were fresh, others faded to yellow, creating a timeline of abuse that made Marion's chest tighten with rage. "How long has this been happening?" Marion asked, her voice carefully controlled as she examined the worst of the injuries. It started small, a push here, a grip too tight there. He always apologized afterward, brought me flowers, promised it would never happen again. Elinor's voice was flat, emotionless, but it did happen again and again. Each time, a little worse. Marion reached for the jar of salve that had appeared on her bedside table along with bandages and other medical supplies. "Why didn't you tell us?" "Because I was ashamed. Because I thought I deserved it somehow. Because he convinced me that no one else would ever want a woman like me, damaged, difficult, demanding." "You're none of those things." Marion's hands were gentle as she applied the healing ointment. "You're kind and intelligent and deserving of love that doesn't leave marks." Tears began sliding down Elinor's cheeks. "I used to dream about running away, but I had nowhere to go, no money of my own, no skills that would support me. He made sure of that. And now a vampire is offering me immortality and freedom from everything that's been killing me slowly." Elinor laughed, but it came out broken. "It's absurd, isn't it? The most unbelievable thing anyone has ever offered me is also the first real hope I've had in years." Marion finished bandaging the worst of the bruises. "Hope doesn't have to be believable to be real." That evening, the three sisters gathered in Cecily's room, sitting before her fire as the storm continued to rage outside. Aunt Cordelia had taken a turn for the worse and was sleeping under Mrs. Hawthorne's careful watch. "She's dying," Cecily said quietly. "The journey here took the last of her strength." "Is that why she brought us?" Elinor asked. "So she could say goodbye?" Marion twisted her wedding ring thoughtfully. "I think she brought us here because she knew we needed saving, and she knew someone who could do it." "A vampire," Cecily said, shaking her head. "If someone had told me a week ago that I'd be seriously considering immortality, I'd have suggested they see a doctor." "And now," Elinor prompted, "now I'm wondering if maybe God works in more mysterious ways than I ever imagined." Cecily opened her worn Bible to a passage she'd marked with a ribbon. "There's a verse that says, 'Therefore, if anyone is in Christ, the new creation has come, the old has gone, the new is here.'" "You think becoming a vampire qualifies as a new creation?" Marion asked, with gentle humor. "I think becoming someone who chooses love over fear, hope over despair, connection over isolation, that qualifies as exactly the kind of transformation God wants for us." Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains and the lights flickered. But inside, three women who had spent their lives defined by others' needs were beginning to imagine what it might feel like to be the authors of their own stories. By the fifth day, at Thorne Manor, a routine had established itself as naturally as snow accumulating on the windowsills. The storm showed no signs of abating, but the sisters found themselves less anxious about being trapped and more grateful for the respite from their former lives. Marion had taken to spending her mornings in the manor's vast library, a cathedral-like space with books stretching from floor to ceiling on 3 levels, connected by elegant spiral staircases. Lord Thorne would often join her there, sharing stories behind various volumes, first editions he had collected across centuries, manuscripts he had commissioned from authors whose names were now carved on tombstones. This morning, she discovered him standing before an ornate music box on one of the reading tables. The piece was clearly ancient, its wooden surface inlaid with mother-of-pearl and silver in patterns that seemed to shift in the firelight. When he wound the delicate mechanism, a haunting melody filled the air, beautiful but melancholy, like a lullaby composed for ghosts. "It's exquisite," Marion said, drawn by the ethereal sound. "And heartbreaking." "Anna composed it for me," Lord Thorne said quietly, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns. "My third wife. She was a musician, gifted with an ability to translate emotion into melody." The music continued its gentle revolution, each note precise yet achingly fragile. Marion found herself thinking of all the Mornings she and Thomas had shared quiet moments over coffee, the comfortable silences that spoke of deep companionship. She understood the weight of loving someone immortal, Lord Thorne continued. This melody captures that the beauty and the sorrow intertwine so closely you can't separate them. Do you regret it? Loving mortals, knowing you'd outlive them? He was quiet for so long that Marion thought he might not answer. Finally, he closed the music box, though the melody seemed to linger in the air. I regret the pain of loss, but never the love itself. Each relationship taught me something different about connection, about the various forms love can take. His grey eyes met hers. With Elinor, I learned that intellectual partnership could be as intimate as physical passion. With Anna, I discovered that sharing beauty, music, art, literature could create bonds that transcended time. And with your first wife, Margaret taught me that even arranged marriages could grow into something real, given patience and kindness. A small smile touched his lips. She also taught me that immortality without growth is merely an extended childhood. Marion found herself moving closer to examine the music box's intricate details. What would you want to learn from us, if we chose to stay? You assume I would be the teacher in such an arrangement, wouldn't you be? You have centuries of experience, wisdom we can't match, but you have something I've lost touch with. He wound the music box again, releasing its haunting melody. You remember what it's like to feel time as precious rather than infinite. You understand urgency, the weight of choices that can't be unmade. After 7 centuries, I sometimes struggle to remember why anything matters when there's always tomorrow to fix today's mistakes. The confession surprised her with its vulnerability. She had begun thinking of him as impossibly wise, forgetting that wisdom and weariness might be close companions. You're saying immortality might be easier with mortal perspectives to balance it? I'm saying that love shared multiplies rather than divides. 3 perspectives, 3 different ways of seeing existence, 3 different strengths to draw upon when the weight of eternity becomes too much to bear alone. Marion felt something flutter in her chest, not quite hope yet, but the possibility of hope. And you believe we could provide that? I believe you already do. He gestured toward the library around them. In 5 days, this space has felt more alive than it has in decades. Your curiosity brings energy to these old books. Your laughter echoes in halls that had grown too quiet. Your very presence reminds me why I choose to continue existing rather than merely enduring. Meanwhile, 2 floors above, Cecily was discovering talents she had forgotten she possessed. Mrs. Hawthorne had invited her to help in the manor's kitchen, not from necessity, but because the housekeeper had noticed Cecily's restless energy and suspected she found purpose in useful activity. The kitchen was a marvel of efficient design spanning multiple centuries. Modern conveniences sat alongside medieval stonework, creating a space that felt both timeless and thoroughly practical. Cecily found herself kneading bread dough with the same meditative focus she had once brought to caring for invalids, but this time the work fed the living rather than comforting the dying. You have healing hands, Mrs. Hawthorne observed, watching Cecily work herbs into a soup that would help strengthen their ailing aunt. Lord Thorne mentioned you spent years caring for the sick. 20 years, Cecily confirmed, adding rosemary with careful precision. Though I'm not sure I ever thought of it as having healing hands, I simply did what needed doing. That's exactly what makes hands capable of healing the willingness to do what's needed without thought of recognition. Cecily paused. In her stirring, what's it like, working for someone who's immortal? Mrs. Hawthorne smiled, the first genuinely warm expression Cecily had seen from the severe-looking woman. Master Thorne is the finest employer I've ever served, and I've worked for several families over my 60 years. He remembers every kindness, never forgets an anniversary or birthday, and treats his staff as family rather than servants. But doesn't it feel strange, knowing what he is? My grandmother worked here before me, and her grandmother before her. Our family has served the Thornes for over 2 centuries. Mrs. Hawthorne began chopping vegetables with practiced efficiency. We've watched him comfort plague victims when doctors had fled, seen him donate anonymously to families facing hardship, witnessed him risk his own safety to protect those under his care. If that's what being a vampire means, then I consider it an honor to serve such a creature. The perspective shift was profound. Cecily had, I've been thinking of vampirism as something dark and dangerous, but Mrs. Hawthorne described it as simply another way of being human, one that came with additional responsibilities rather than freedoms. That evening found Elinor in the manor's conservatory, a glass-walled room that should have been freezing in the blizzard, but remained comfortably warm through some system she didn't understand. Lord Thorne had found her there, staring out at the snow-laden garden, and had quietly begun playing piano, nothing specific, just gentle improvisations that seemed to match the rhythm of falling snow. "I used to play," Elinor said suddenly, "before I married Edmund. He said it was a waste of time, that I should focus on more practical accomplishments." Lord Thorne's hands stilled on the keys. "What did you enjoy playing?" "Chopin, mostly. His nocturnes could make me forget everything else existed. Show me." The invitation was so gentle that Elinor found herself moving to the piano bench before she could talk herself out of it. Her fingers found the keys hesitantly at first, muscle memory fighting through years of disuse. But gradually, the opening notes of Nocturne in E-flat major began to fill the conservatory. She stumbled several times, her technique rusty from neglect, but Lord Thorne simply listened with the patience of someone who had eternity to spare. When she finished, her cheeks were wet with tears she hadn't realized she was shedding. "Beautiful," he said simply. "Both the music and the courage it took to reclaim it. I'd forgotten how much I loved it, how much I loved feeling capable of creating something beautiful. Edmund took that from you. Edmund took everything from me. Piece by piece, year by year, until I couldn't remember who I had been before I became his wife." Her voice carried a strength that surprised them both. "But sitting here now, playing again, I remember that I used to believe I was worth something." Lord Thorne's expression grew fierce with protective anger. "You are worth everything. Never doubt that." Outside, the storm continued its relentless assault on the ancient stones, but inside the conservatory, a woman who had forgotten her own value was slowly remembering how to see herself as worthy of love. The 6th morning brought a subtle shift in the manor's atmosphere. Aunt Cordelia's condition had stabilized somewhat, allowing her to join them for breakfast in the smaller dining room. Though still frail, her eyes held the sharp intelligence that had made her such a formidable presence in their London social circles. "You're all looking better," she observed, studying each of her nieces in turn. "More alive than I've seen any of you in years." Marion realized it was true. The constant tension she had carried since Thomas's death had begun to ease, replaced by something that felt almost like anticipation. Cecily moved with more purpose, no longer the perpetually worried caretaker but a down woman discovering her own desires. And Elinor was sitting straighter, meeting eyes directly instead of ducking her head in habitual self-protection. "Victor's been good for you," Cordelia continued, accepting a cup of tea from Lord Thorne himself, "just as I hoped he would be." "How long have you known?" Cecily asked. "About what he is, I mean." A smile played at the corners of Cordelia's lips. 50 years. Give or take. I was quite the beauty in my youth, you know, and I had several suitors. Victor was among them, though he looked exactly as he does now." The sisters exchanged glances. This revelation cast their aunt's matchmaking in an entirely new light. "You were in love with him," Marion said. "Not quite a question. Desperately. But I was also wise enough to know that I wasn't suited for immortality. I wanted children, a normal life, the comfort of aging alongside a partner." Cordelia's expression grew distant. Victor understood this about me better than I understood it myself. He withdrew his suit gracefully and remained a cherished friend instead. Lord Thorne covered Cordelia's weathered hand with his own. You chose happiness over passion. It was the right decision for who you were then. And now, I'm dying. And my greatest fear was that these three magnificent women would follow my example, choosing familiar pain over the possibility of extraordinary joy. Cordelia looked at each sister with fierce love. That's why I brought you here. Not to die in comfortable surroundings, but to live in ways you've never dared imagine. After breakfast, Lord Thorne approached the sisters with a question that had been building for days. Would you like to see the transformation chamber? He asked. Understanding the process might help you make your decision with full knowledge rather than fearful imagination. They agreed, following him through corridors they hadn't explored before, deeper into the manor's ancient heart. The chamber he eventually revealed was unlike anything they had expected. Instead of a dark, frightening space, the transformation chamber was breathtakingly beautiful. Circular walls rose to a domed ceiling, painted with constellations that seemed to move in the flickering light of dozens of candles. The floor was inlaid marble in patterns that drew the eye toward a raised dais in the center, upon which sat what appeared to be the most comfortable bed imaginable. Ancient symbols were carved into the walls, not threatening or dark, but elegant and somehow comforting. Flowers and herbs hung from the ceiling in carefully arranged bouquets, filling the air with scents that reminded Marion of spring gardens and Elinor of her mother's perfume. It's beautiful, Elinor breathed. Transformation should be peaceful, Lord Thorne explained. The change itself is profound enough without adding unnecessary fear or discomfort. Cecily approached one wall to examine the symbols more closely. What do these mean? Protection, blessing, safe passage from one state of being to another. They've been carved and recarved for centuries, each generation of my kind, adding their own prayers for successful transformation. How many people have you transformed? Marion asked. 7. Over the course of 700 years, 3 chose to remain with me for extended periods. 1 decided immortality wasn't suited to her nature and chose to end her existence peacefully. 3 others left to explore the world and build their own communities. His expression grew thoughtful. All remained dear to me, regardless of their choices. What makes you think we might be different? Elinor asked. You're not just individuals seeking escape from mortality. You're a family unit, bound by love and shared experience. That creates stability that isolated transformation lacks. He gestured toward the comfortable furnishings around the chamber's perimeter. The process takes 3 days. You would rest here, together, and I would remain to monitor your progress and provide comfort during any difficult moments. All of us at the same time, Cecily asked. If that's your preference. The bond between you would actually make the transformation easier. You would draw strength from each other rather than facing the change alone. Marion found herself imagining it, lying in this peaceful space with her sisters, letting go of everything that had defined her mortal existence while embracing something entirely new. The thought should have terrified her, but instead it felt like the most natural thing in the world. That evening, the 3 sisters gathered in Marion's room for what had become their nightly discussion. But tonight felt different, charged with possibility rather than mere speculation. I've been thinking about Thomas, Marion began, settling into her favorite chair by the fire. About what he would want for me. And, Cecily prompted gently, he would want me to be happy. He would want me to love again, to build something beautiful, to stop treating grief like a faithful companion. Marion's voice strengthened with conviction. He would be absolutely furious if he knew I'd been offered eternity with 2 people I adore and was hesitating because of loyalty to a memory. Elinor curled up on the window seat, looking out at the snow that continued falling in thick sheets. I dreamed about Edmund last night. He was standing in our London house, waiting for me to return, getting angrier with each hour that passed. "That sounds like a nightmare," Cecily said. It was, until I realized that in the dream, I wasn't afraid of his anger anymore. I was safe somewhere else, somewhere he could never reach me, surrounded by people who actually cared about my well-being. Elinor turned from the window. I woke up feeling free for the first time in 5 years. Cecily had been quiet during this exchange, but now she leaned forward with the intensity of someone who had reached an important conclusion. "I've spent my entire adult life asking what God wanted from me," she said, "but maybe I've been asking the wrong question. Maybe I should be asking what God wants for me." "And what do you think the answer is?" Marion asked. "I think God wants me to choose love over fear, hope over resignation, connection over isolation." Cecily's voice carried absolute conviction. "I think everything that's happened, losing our parents, caring for the dying, bringing us here through Aunt Cordelia, has been preparing us for this choice." "So we're all leaning toward yes," Elinor said quietly. "We're all leaning toward forever," Marion corrected. Outside, thunder rolled across the mountains despite the snow, and the manor's lights flickered. But inside, 3 women who had spent their lives defined by loss were finally ready to choose gain. "Should we tell him?" Cecily asked. "Tomorrow," Marion said. "Tonight, let's just sit with the certainty that we're about to become the authors of our own extraordinary story." The fire crackled in the grate, and snow continued its relentless dance against the windows, but inside the warm circle of sisterly love, the future felt bright with infinite possibility. The 7th morning dawned with an ominous stillness. The relentless wind that had howled around the manor for days had finally ceased, leaving behind a silence so complete it felt like the world holding its breath. Marion woke with an inexplicable sense of unease, as if something fundamental had shifted in the night. She found Lord Thorne in the library, standing motionless before the tall windows that overlooked the manor's front approach. His posture spoke of tension carefully controlled, and when she approached, she could see why. In the distance, a lone figure on horseback was making its way up the snow-covered drive. "Someone's coming," she said unnecessarily. "Someone's been coming for 2 days," he replied, his voice carrying an edge she had never heard before. "I could sense him approaching through the storm, but I hoped—" He stopped, his jaw tightening. "Hoped what?" "That your aunt had not done something tragically well-intentioned." Before Marion could ask what he meant, the sound of the great doors opening echoed through the manor. Heavy boots stomped across the entrance hall, followed by Mrs. Hawthorne's cool voice requesting that the visitor wait while she announced his arrival. When she appeared in the library doorway, her expression was carefully neutral. "My lord, Father Blackwood from St. Catherine's in Edinburgh, requests an audience. He says he's come about the 3 ladies." Marion felt ice form in her veins. Lord Thorne's expression remained perfectly composed, but she caught the slight tightening around his eyes. "Show him in, Mrs. Hawthorne, and please ask the sisters to join us immediately." Within moments, a tall, severe-looking man entered the library. Father Blackwood appeared to be in his 40s, with iron-grey hair and the lean build of someone accustomed to physical hardship. He wore the simple black robes of a Catholic priest, but there was something about his bearing that suggested military training beneath the religious calling. What caught Marion's attention immediately was the silver cross hanging from his neck, not the simple crucifixes worn by most clergy, but an ornate piece that seemed to gleam with its own inner light. The metal was carved with symbols that hurt her eyes to look at directly, and she found herself instinctively stepping closer to Lord Thorne. "Lord Thorne, Father," Blackwood said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I've come for the Whitmore sisters. Have you indeed?" Lord Thorne's tone was pleasant, conversational, but Marion could sense the danger coiled beneath the surface. And what makes you think they require rescue? By this time, Cecily and Elinor had arrived, both looking confused by the unexpected visitor. Aunt Cordelia appeared behind them, leaning heavily on a walking stick, but moving with more strength than she had shown in days. Because their dear aunt sent word before she left London that she feared for their souls, Father, Blackwood replied, his gaze moving to each sister in turn before settling on Cordelia. Lady Cordelia, your letter was quite specific about the nature of the danger they faced. Cordelia's face went ashen. Marcus, I never. You wrote that you were bringing 3 innocent women into the domain of a creature of darkness, that you feared you were condemning them to eternal damnation in exchange for temporary salvation from their earthly troubles. The priest reached into his robes and withdrew a folded letter. Your exact words, I believe. Marion snatched the letter from his hands, recognizing her aunt's familiar handwriting immediately. As she read, her heart sank. The letter was indeed from Cordelia, written in what appeared to be a state of feverish delirium, begging the church to send someone to save her nieces from the vampire who has bewitched them with promises of immortal love. Aunt Cordelia, Elinor said quietly, you didn't know what you were writing, did you? I was so ill when I wrote it, Cordelia said, her voice breaking. The fever, the medicine the doctors gave me, I barely remember putting pen to paper. I certainly don't remember posting anything. Your maid found the letter, and knowing of your connection to the church, ensured it was delivered. Father Blackwood explained with what he probably thought was kindness. She was concerned about your state of mind and wanted to honor what she believed were your final wishes. Lord Thorne had remained silent during this exchange, but now he spoke with careful precision. And what exactly do you propose to do, Father? I propose to take these women away from this place before you can complete whatever dark ritual you have planned. The priest's hand moved to the silver cross at his throat. I know what you are, creature. I know what you offer, and I know the price that comes with it. Do you indeed? Lord Thorne's smile held no warmth whatsoever. Then please enlighten us all about the price of immortality, eternal damnation, the loss of one's soul, separation from God's grace and the promise of heaven. Father Blackwood's voice rose with evangelical fervor. You offer these women an eternity of darkness in exchange for a few decades of earthly pleasure. Marion felt anger building in her chest, not fear, but righteous rage. And what exactly do you know about our earthly lives, Father? What insight do you have into the pain we've been carrying? I know that no earthly suffering justifies trading one's immortal soul. Do you know that I've been a widow for 2 years, drowning in grief so deep I sometimes forget to breathe? Marion's voice cut across his platitudes. Do you know that? Cecily spent 20 years caring for dying relatives until she forgot she was allowed to live for herself? Do you know that Elinor's husband beats her so regularly that she flinches when anyone raises their voice? Father Blackwood's expression flickered, but his resolve didn't waver. Suffering is temporary. Damnation is eternal. And what if you're wrong? Cecily asked, her practical nature asserting itself. What if choosing love over fear, connection over isolation, hope over despair? What if those choices actually bring us closer to God rather than further away? You've been deceived by a master manipulator, the priest replied. This creature has had centuries to perfect his ability to make evil appear as good. Lord Thorne laughed a sound with no humor in it. Father Blackwood, I've spent 7 centuries learning to live with the weight of immortality. I've loved and lost, built and destroyed, saved lives and taken them. I've had ample opportunity to become the monster you imagine me to be. His eyes grew cold as winter storms. But I've also had centuries to learn that love shared multiplies rather than diminishes, that connection creates meaning, where isolation breeds despair, and that choosing to protect and cherish those weaker than yourself is perhaps the most godly act an immortal creature can perform. Pretty words from a demon's tongue. "Father Blackwood," Elinor said, her voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone in the room. "Have you ever been married to someone who convinced you that you deserved pain? Have you ever spent years believing that your highest purpose was to suffer in silence while others determined your worth? That has nothing to do with, it has everything to do with this." Elinor stepped forward, and for the first time since Marion had known her, she moved without fear. "Lord Thorne has offered us something unprecedented, the chance to choose our own destiny, not salvation imposed by others, not rescue that requires us to remain grateful and diminished, but actual choice. The freedom to say yes to love, to family, to building something beautiful that will endure." Father Blackwood's hand tightened on his silver cross, and Marion noticed that the symbols carved into its surface seemed to pulse more brightly. "You're under his influence. None of you are thinking clearly." "We're thinking more clearly than we have in years," Cecily said firmly, "and we choose to stay. That choice is not yours to make." The priest's voice carried absolute authority. "I have the backing of the church and the civil authorities. These women will come with me, willingly or otherwise." The temperature in the library seemed to drop 10 degrees. Lord Thorne moved with inhuman speed, placing himself between the sisters and their would-be rescuer. "Father Blackwood," he said softly, and there was something in his voice that made the windows rattle, "I suggest you reconsider your approach." The priest raised his silver cross, and the carved symbols flared with brilliant light that made everyone except Lord Thorne shield their eyes. "Back, demon! By the power of Christ I compel you." Lord Thorne didn't retreat. Instead, he smiled an expression that revealed teeth sharper than they had appeared before. "Father, your faith is admirable, but your information is outdated. I am neither compelled nor particularly impressed by threats." The silver cross continued to blaze, but Lord Thorne reached out and grasped it in his bare hand. The metal should have burned him, should have caused him agonizing pain if the legends were true. Instead, he simply held it while meeting the priest's shocked gaze. "Faith is powerful," he said conversationally, "but love, freely chosen, is more powerful still. These women have made their decision, and I will honor it, regardless of what authority you claim to represent." Father Blackwood stared at his ineffective cross, his worldview cracking visibly. "This is impossible." "This is truth," Lord Thorne replied, releasing the cross and stepping back. "Now, I suggest you leave my home before you discover exactly how protective I can become when someone threatens my family." The word family resonated through the library like a bell. Marion realized that sometime during the confrontation, she had moved to stand beside Lord Thorne, with Cecily and Elinor flanking her. They presented a united front, not victims awaiting rescue, but allies prepared to defend their chosen future. Father Blackwood looked around the room, seeing perhaps for the first time that the women he had come to save had no interest in salvation that required abandoning love. "This isn't over," he said finally. "Yes," Lord Thorne replied with quiet certainty. "It is." Father Blackwood's departure left a tension in the air that seemed to seep into the very stones of the manor. He had not gone far, merely to the village at the base of the mountain, where Lord Thorne's enhanced senses could detect him, making arrangements that boded ill for their newfound peace. "He's gathering reinforcements," Lord Thorne said quietly as they stood in the library, watching the priest's figure disappear into the tree line. "I can hear fragments of his conversations carried on the wind. He speaks of cleansing fire and holy intervention." Marion felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. How many people could he convince to help him? In isolated mountain communities, fear of the supernatural runs deep. If he frames this correctly, 3 innocent women held captive by a demonic creature, he could rally significant support. Lord Thorne's expression grew grim, especially if he claims divine sanction for what they're planning. Elinor moved closer to the window, her newly found courage warring with old instincts toward fear. What kind of support? Torches, holy water, wooden stakes, silver weapons. The traditional tools of vampire hunters, backed by religious fervor and community righteousness. He turned from the window to face them directly. They'll come believing they're saving your souls and protecting the world from evil. The weight of the situation settled over them like a heavy cloak. Cecily sank into one of the leather chairs, her practical mind already working through the implications. "How long do we have?" she asked. "Perhaps 24 hours. Enough time for him to convince the villagers, gather supplies, and organize an assault." Lord Thorne moved to a desk near the fireplace and began withdrawing items from its drawers. "But also enough time for us to complete your transformation, if that's truly your choice." The 3 sisters exchanged glances. The decision they had been approaching gradually was now forced into sharp focus by external threat. "Is it safe?" Marion asked. "To undergo the change with hostile forces approaching? The transformation leaves you vulnerable for the first several hours." "Lord," Thorne admitted, "your human strength fades before your supernatural abilities fully manifest. Under normal circumstances, I would advise waiting for more favorable conditions." "But these aren't normal circumstances," Elinor said. "No, they're not." From the desk drawer, he withdrew a small wooden box that appeared to be very old. "Which brings us to a choice that cannot be unmade. If you choose transformation now, you do so, knowing that your first acts as immortals may be defending yourselves against those who believe they're saving you." Lord Thorne opened the box to reveal 3 silver pendants, each about the size of a coin and intricately designed. The pendants were connected by delicate chains that could be linked together, forming a single piece of jewelry from 3 individual parts. "These belong to the last family I transformed," he said, holding up the connected pendants so they could see how they fit together. "3 sisters much like yourselves who came to me fleeing the Irish potato famine in 1847. They designed these pendants to represent their unbreakable bond, 3 separate pieces that were stronger when united than any could be alone." Marion reached out to touch one of the pendants, feeling the smooth warmth of the silver against her fingertips. The craftsmanship was exquisite, with symbols that seemed to represent different aspects of sisterhood: protection, love, shared strength. "What happened to them?" Cecily asked. "They thrived, built a community of their own in the American territories, used their immortality to help other refugees and displaced persons. They still write to me occasionally, 3 remarkable women who found ways to use eternity for healing rather than selfish pursuits." His expression softened. "They left these here as a gift for whoever might follow in their footsteps." "You're saying we're not the first family to face this choice," Elinor said. "You're the first in over 70 years, and the first to face it under such pressured circumstances. But no, you're not the first to discover that love shared among sisters can create bonds strong enough to transcend mortality." Lord Thorne closed the box and set it on the table between them. "The choice is yours, but it must be made soon. If Father Blackwood returns with an armed mob and you're still human, I cannot guarantee your safety. My abilities are considerable, but even I cannot protect 3 mortals against a determined crowd while maintaining the moral constraints I've chosen to live by." "Moral constraints?" Marion asked. "I could slaughter them all in moments," he said matter-of-factly, "but doing so would make me the monster they believe me to be. It would also traumatize you in ways that could poison your immortality before it properly begins." The brutal honesty of the statement hung in the air. Cecily leaned forward, her expression thoughtful. "If we transform tonight, How long before we're capable of defending ourselves? The physical weakness lasts approximately 12 hours. Your mental clarity returns within 6, but your supernatural abilities emerge gradually over the first 24 hours. Lord Thorne moved to stoke the fire, though Marion suspected the action was more for their psychological comfort than any need for warmth. However, the bond between you would provide additional strength. Transformed sisters often display remarkable resilience because they draw upon each other's power. "And you would stay with us throughout the process?" Elinor asked. "I would not leave your side until you were fully awakened and in control of your new abilities." Marion found herself thinking of Thomas again, but this time the memory brought comfort rather than pain. He had always told her that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but action taken in spite of fear. Looking at her sisters, Cecily, with her newfound determination to choose her own happiness, Elinor, radiating a strength that abuse had never quite managed to break, she realized that courage was exactly what they were displaying. "We should tell him," she said quietly. "Tell me what?" Lord Thorne asked, though something in his expression suggested he already suspected. "That we've made our decision," Cecily said, her voice steady and sure. "We want to stay. We want to transform. We want to become your family." The change that came over Lord Thorne's face was extraordinary. 7 centuries of loneliness seemed to lift from his shoulders, replaced by something that could only be described as profound joy. For a moment, he looked not like an ancient, powerful creature, but like a man who had just been given the greatest gift of his long existence. "Are you certain?" he asked, though his voice carried hope that was almost painful to hear. "Once begun, the process cannot be reversed." "We're certain," Elinor said, and Marion realized that her youngest sister had never sounded more confident about anything in her life. Lord Thorne nodded slowly, then moved with sudden purpose toward the desk, where he began gathering additional items, old books, vials of liquid that gleamed with their own inner light, candles that smelled of herbs and growing things. "Then we should begin immediately. The transformation chamber needs to be prepared, and there are rituals that must be observed to ensure your change proceeds safely." "What can we do to help?" Marion asked. "Say goodbye to your mortal selves," he replied seriously. "The women who walk out of that chamber tomorrow will be fundamentally changed. Still yourselves, but expanded beyond anything you can currently imagine. Take time to acknowledge what you're leaving behind." As if summoned by the gravity of the moment, Mrs. Hawthorne appeared in the doorway. "My lord, I've prepared the chamber according to your instructions. Fresh flowers, clean linens, and the ceremonial items you requested." "Thank you." Lord Thorne turned back to the sisters. "We should go upstairs." And he stopped speaking suddenly, his head tilted as if listening to something they couldn't hear. His expression grew sharp with alarm. "What is it?" Cecily asked. "They're not waiting until tomorrow," he said grimly. "Father Blackwood has convinced them that every hour of delay allows me to strengthen my hold over you. They're coming tonight." Through the library windows, they could see lights moving through the forest, dozens of torches, creating a constellation of approaching threat. The village mob was larger than any of them had anticipated, and they were moving with the determination of people who believed they were fighting for righteous causes. "How long?" Marion asked, surprised by her own calm. "Perhaps 2 hours before they reach the manor." Lord Thorne gathered the sisters' unity pendants and pressed the box into Marion's hands. "Not enough time for safe transformation, but perhaps enough for something else." "What do you mean?" "I mean that if you truly choose this path, if you truly want to become my family, then we face this threat together. As equals, as allies, as people who have chosen love over fear." His eyes blazed with fierce protectiveness. "They think they're rescuing helpless victims. Let's show them exactly how wrong they are." Outside, the torches continued their inexorable approach through the snow-covered forest. But inside the library, 4 people who had found family in the most unexpected circumstances began preparing to defend their right to choose love, even if that love came with fangs and forever. Marion opened the box and lifted out the unity pendants, their silver surfaces catching the firelight like captured stars. Whatever came next, they would face it together, 3 sisters and the vampire who had given them back their lives. The transformation chamber had been prepared, but not for the peaceful ceremony Lord Thorne had originally envisioned. Instead of a sanctuary for gentle change, it had become a fortress where 4 souls would make their stand against fear and ignorance. "The manor's protections are strong," Lord Thorne explained as he secured the chamber's ancient doors. "But they were designed to keep out natural threats, not organized human assault backed by religious fervor." From around his neck, he lifted a pendant, none of them had noticed, before a dark red stone, the size of a robin's egg, set in silver that seemed to pulse with its own inner rhythm. The moment it was fully revealed, the stone began to glow with deep crimson light that cast dancing shadows across the chamber walls. "The bloodstone amulet," he said, noticing their fascination. "It's been in my family for over 1,000 years. During transformation, it amplifies the natural magic that changes mortal flesh into something more durable." "But we're not transforming," Marion said, though part of her wondered if they should reconsider given the approaching threat. "No, but the port amulet serves another purpose. It can temporarily grant mortals access to supernatural strength and resilience." His grey eyes met each of theirs in turn. "If you're willing to accept the risk." "What risk?" Cecily asked, her practical nature demanding specifics. "The process is painful, and there's no guarantee your mortal bodies can handle the strain. You might die from the experience rather than simply being temporarily enhanced." Outside the chamber, they could hear the distant sounds of arrival, shouts, the stamping of many feet, Father Blackwood's voice rising above the chaos as he organized his impromptu army. "Or we might die anyway if we can't defend ourselves," Elinor pointed out with a calmness that surprised everyone, including herself. Lord Thorne smiled grimly. "That's certainly possible." Marion looked at her sisters, seeing her own determination reflected in their faces. "Do it." "All of us?" he asked. "All of us," Cecily confirmed. "We're stronger together than apart." Lord Thorne nodded and began the process immediately. The bloodstone amulet's glow intensified as he held it above each sister in turn, speaking words in a language that predated any they recognized. The ancient syllables seemed to resonate not just in the air, but in their very bones. When the red light touched Marion first, she felt fire race through her veins, not the destroying flame of fever, but the energizing burn of life intensified beyond normal limits. Her vision sharpened until she could see individual dust motes dancing in the chamber's candlelight. Her hearing became so acute she could distinguish between the footsteps of different men approaching outside. Cecily gasped as the enhancement took hold, her hands moving to her chest as if her heart were beating too fast and too strong. But instead of weakness, she felt power flooding through her limbs, the strength she had used for decades in service of others, multiplied and concentrated into something formidable. Elinor's transformation was the most dramatic. Years of cowering, of making herself small and unthreatening, seemed to burn away in moments. She straightened to her full height, and when she looked up, her eyes blazed with the confidence of someone who would never again allow herself to be diminished by another's cruelty. "How do you feel?" Lord Thorne asked. "Magnificent," Marion breathed, and realized it was the first time she had used that word to describe herself since Thomas died. "Like I could move mountains," Cecily added, flexing her hands and marveling at the power she could feel coursing beneath her skin. "Like I could face down Edmund and every other man who ever thought I was too weak to matter," Elinor said, her voice ringing with newfound authority. The sounds from outside had grown closer and more organized. Through the chamber's high windows, they could see the orange glow of torches reflected against the snow. Father Blackwood's voice carried clearly, now, as he directed his followers in surrounding the manor. "Ladies and gentlemen of the village," the priest's voice boomed across the snow-covered grounds. "We come here tonight not as conquerors, but as liberators. 3 innocent women are held captive within these walls by a creature that has fed on human suffering for centuries." "That's not true," Elinor said, her enhanced hearing picking up every word. "Of course it's not," Lord Thorne replied. "But truth has never been the primary concern of those who wage war in the name of righteousness." Father Blackwood continued his speech, his voice growing more fervent with each sentence. "This vampire has corrupted their minds, made them believe they choose to stay here willingly. But we know that evil's greatest weapon is deception, making sin appear as virtue, damnation as salvation. He's really quite good at this," Cecily observed with dark humor. 7 centuries of dealing with vampire hunters has taught me that they excel at rhetoric," Lord Thorne said. "Facts are considerably less important than passion when building a mob." The speech outside reached its crescendo. "Tonight, we cleanse this evil from our mountains. Tonight, we show these lost women that their community will not abandon them to darkness. Tonight, we prove that faith triumphs over fear, that light overcomes shadow." A cheer went up from the assembled villagers, perhaps 30 or 40 people, armed with everything from farming tools to hunting weapons. Marion could see them through the windows now, their faces illuminated by torchlight, twisted with the kind of righteous anger that made ordinary people capable of extraordinary violence. "They really believe they're saving us," she realized. "Which makes them more dangerous than simple greed or hatred would," Lord Thorne replied. "People fighting for what they believe is right will go to lengths that purely selfish motivations cannot match." The first impacts against the manors, doors echoed through the building. The villagers had brought axes and hammers, and they were attacking the ancient wood with systematic determination. "How long will the doors hold?" Elinor asked. "Against normal human strength? Hours. Against a mob driven by religious fervor and armed with blessed weapons?" Lord Thorne shrugged. "Perhaps 20 minutes. Marion felt the bloodstone's power singing in her veins, making her feel more alive and capable than she ever had as a purely mortal woman. Looking at her sisters, seeing the same supernatural confidence blazing in their eyes, she realized that whatever happened next, they were no longer the broken, helpless women who had arrived here a week ago. "Then let's make those 20 minutes count," she said. The pounding on the doors intensified, and somewhere in the distance, Father Blackwood began chanting in Latin words of blessing and protection that were meant to weaken the vampire's power and strengthen the faithful. But in the transformation chamber, 4 people who had chosen love over fear began preparing for the fight of their lives. The manor's great doors finally splintered under the mob's assault, sending echoes of destruction throughout the ancient halls. Through the transformation chamber's windows, the sisters could see torches spreading across the grounds like fallen stars, illuminating faces twisted with righteous fury. "They're inside," Lord Thorne said, his enhanced hearing tracking the invaders' progress through his home. "Father Blackwood is leading them directly toward this chamber. He seems to know exactly where to find us." "How is that possible?" Marion asked, her own supernatural senses now picking up the sound of boots on stone, the harsh breathing of people driven by religious fervor. "Blessed silver acts as a compass when seeking supernatural creatures," he explained grimly. "That cross of his is more than mere symbol, it's a hunting tool." The approaching footsteps grew, louder, accompanied by Father Blackwood's voice rising in Latin incantations meant to weaken vampire powers. But as the chanting reached the transformation chamber, something unexpected happened. In the center of the room, where centuries of successful transformations had taken place, a flame suddenly blazed to life, not from any candle or torch, but emerging from the very stones themselves. The fire burned with colors that shouldn't exist, deep blues shifting to silver, gold that seemed to contain starlight, crimson that pulsed like a living heart. The eternal flame, Lord Thorne breathed, and for the first time since the siege began, he sounded surprised. "It hasn't appeared in over a century. What does it mean?" Cecily asked, though she felt oddly drawn to the beautiful, impossible fire. "It manifests only when true love is threatened by false righteousness," he said, his voice filled with wonder. "The magic that built this place, that has protected my family for centuries, it recognizes what we've built together." The flame pulsed brighter, and suddenly the sisters could feel its power flowing through them, augmenting the temporary enhancements from the bloodstone amulet. But more than physical strength, the fire seemed to fill them with absolute certainty about their choices, their bond, their right to defend the family they had chosen. Father Blackwood's voice reached a crescendo just outside the chamber doors. "Break it down. The demon holds them in the very heart of his corruption." The doors began to shake under renewed assault, but the eternal flame blazed higher in response. Its light cast dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move independently, creating the illusion that the chamber itself was alive and protective. "Whatever happens," Lord Thorne said, his grey eyes reflecting the flame's otherworldly colours, "remember that you chose this. Remember that love freely given is the most powerful force in any realm, mortal or immortal." The doors burst inward, and Father Blackwood strode into the chamber at the head of a dozen armed villagers. But instead of finding cowering victims awaiting rescue, he discovered 4 people standing united around a pillar of impossible fire, radiating power that made the air itself shimmer. "Stand down, demon," he commanded, raising his silver cross. "Release these women from your unholy influence." "I am not holding them," Lord Thorne replied, with deadly calm. "They are choosing to stay." "Lies." Father Blackwood's eyes blazed with fanatic certainty. "No righteous woman would willingly consort with creatures of darkness." Marion stepped forward, her movement fluid and confident in a way that made several villagers step back involuntarily. "Father, I appreciate your concern for our souls, but you're mistaken about our circumstances. You've been bewitched, child. Your minds have been corrupted." "Our minds have been freed," Elinor interrupted, and her voice carried such authority that even Father Blackwood paused. "For the first time in our lives, we're making choices based on love rather than fear. This creature offers you damnation disguised as salvation. This man offers us family," Cecily said firmly. "He offers us the chance to build something beautiful that will endure beyond the brief span of mortal existence." The eternal flame pulsed in response to their words, its light growing so brilliant that several villagers had to shield their eyes. But Father Blackwood pressed forward, his silver cross blazing with competing radiance. "I will not allow you to corrupt these innocent souls," he declared, lunging toward Lord Thorne with the blessed silver extended like a weapon. What happened next unfolded with supernatural speed. Lord Thorne could have killed the priest instantly, could have torn through the assembled villagers like paper. Instead, he caught Father Blackwood's wrist with careful precision, stopping the attack, without causing harm. But the sisters moved as one, their temporary enhancements allowing them to act faster than human reflexes should permit. They didn't attack the villagers. Instead, they positioned themselves as living shields between Lord Thorne and the mob, their unity presenting such a formidable barrier that the would-be rescuers hesitated. "You see?" Marion called out, her voice carrying clearly to every person in the chamber. "We're not victims. We're allies. We're family." The eternal flame roared higher, its impossible colors washing over the assembled crowd. And in that light, something shifted. The villagers' expressions began to change, from righteous fury to confused uncertainty. Looking at the 4 figures standing united around the otherworldly fire, It became difficult to see captors and victims, evil and good. Instead, they saw something that challenged every assumption they had brought to this confrontation. They saw love, freely chosen and fiercely defended. Father Blackwood stared at his silver cross, which had gone dark and cold in the presence of the eternal flame. For the first time since entering the chamber, doubt flickered across his features. "This is impossible," he whispered. "This is truth," Lord Thorne replied gently, releasing the priest's wrist. "Perhaps it's time you considered whether your definitions of good and evil might be more limited than the reality you're witnessing." The flame continued to burn between them, neither threatening nor diminishing, but simply existing as proof that some bonds transcend conventional understanding. Spring came to Thorne Manor with unprecedented gentleness, as if the earth itself were celebrating the resolution of the winter's extraordinary events. The transformation chamber had been restored to its original purpose 3 months after the confrontation with Father Blackwood, but the change the sisters underwent there was far different from what any of them had originally imagined. They had chosen immortality, yes, but not immediately. The eternal flame's manifestation had convinced them that their bond was already strong enough to transcend normal limitations. Instead of rushing into transformation, they had elected to spend a year as mortals enhanced by the Bloodstone amulet, learning to use their new abilities while gradually adapting to the reality of supernatural existence. Lord Thorne had agreed to this approach with characteristic patience. "Immortality will still be available to you in a year's time," he had said. "But this experience will make the eventual change feel like natural progression rather than desperate escape." The confrontation with the villagers had ended not in violence, but in understanding. Father Blackwood, shaken by his silver cross's failure and the undeniable evidence of genuine love before him, had eventually agreed to listen rather than condemn. The eternal flame had burned for 3 hours that night, during which time Lord Thorne had shared his true history, not as a monster who preyed on the innocent, but as a man who had spent centuries learning to use his gifts in service of others. The villagers had returned to their homes with a story far different from the one they had expected to tell. Some remained skeptical, but most had been convinced by what they witnessed. 3 women, defending a choice made freely, a vampire who had chosen protection over predation, and love that manifested as literal miracle. Marion now spent her mornings in the manor's expanded library, which Lord Thorne had enlarged to accommodate her growing collection of books on grief counseling and widow support. The enhanced empathy that came with her supernatural abilities had revealed a calling she never would have discovered in her previous life. She was writing a book about finding love after loss, drawing on both her experience with Thomas and her unexpected second chance with Lord Thorne. The wedding ring still graced her finger, but it no longer symbolized guilt or unchangeable loyalty to the past. Instead, it represented the foundation that had made her capable of loving again, proof that a heart expanded by loss could contain multiple loves without diminishing either. Cecily had transformed the manor's kitchen into something approaching a small restaurant, where she experimented with recipes that combined traditional techniques with ingredients that could satisfy both mortal and immortal palates. Her enhanced strength made cooking effortless in ways that allowed her to focus on creativity rather than mere sustenance. For the first time in her life, she was creating beauty for its own sake rather than simply fulfilling others' needs. More importantly, she had begun saying no. When visitors from the village requested her help with various domestic crises, she offered assistance on her own terms rather than dropping everything to accommodate their schedules. The transformation had been liberating in ways that had nothing to do with supernatural abilities. Elinor had become the manor's unofficial guardian, using her enhanced senses and newfound confidence to ensure that the estate remained a sanctuary for anyone seeking refuge from circumstances they couldn't control. She had already helped 3 other women escape abusive marriages, providing them with safe passage to new lives and the resources to begin again. Her piano playing had returned with supernatural precision, but more importantly, with joy that infected everyone who heard her perform. The conservatory had become a gathering place where music seemed to heal old wounds and celebrate new possibilities. Lord Thorne moved through his days with an energy that 7 centuries of existence hadn't quite managed to extinguish. The manor felt alive in ways it hadn't for decades, filled with laughter and purpose and the comfortable chaos that comes with family life. He had stopped counting years and started measuring time in 22 mine. Shared moments, Marion's hand, finding his while they read together, Cecily's delighted laughter when a new recipe succeeded, Elinor's confident stride as she moved through halls where she belonged absolutely. On this particular spring morning, the 4 of them gathered in the conservatory where a local artist was putting finishing touches on a commissioned painting. The family portrait had been Cecily's idea, a way to commemorate the anniversary of their decision to stay together. The painting captured them as they truly were, not as vampire and victims, but as equals who had chosen each other across every obstacle. Lord Thorne sat at the piano bench, his hands resting on keys that had been silent too long before Elinor brought music back to the manor. Marion stood behind him, one hand on his shoulder, a book open in her other hand as she shared some passage that had caught her attention. Cecily and Elinor flanked them, their sisterly bond evident in the way they leaned toward each other while maintaining their distinct personalities. But the most remarkable element of the portrait was something the artist had captured without quite understanding it, the sense that these 4 people existed in their own sphere of time, where external pressures and conventional expectations held no power. "It's perfect," Marion said, studying the completed work. "It's true," Lord Thorne corrected, "which is far better than perfect." As they admired the painting, each of them reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. A year ago, they had been strangers bound only by family obligation and desperate circumstances. Now, they were something unprecedented, a chosen family that transcended every conventional boundary. Aunt Cordelia, who had recovered her health along with her peace of mind about her role in bringing them together, had returned to London with stories that she shared selectively. Her nieces had found happiness in Scotland, she reported. They had married well and were thriving in ways that made their old lives seem like mere preparation for their true purposes. The lies were kind ones, designed to allow their former identities to rest in peace while their true selves flourished in immortal possibility. That evening, as spring rain drummed against the conservatory windows, the 4 of them gathered around the piano while Elinor played melodies that seemed to capture everything they couldn't quite put into words. Lord Thorne's vampire nature allowed him to love without the fear of loss that had defined his mortal relationships. The sisters' enhanced humanity let them embrace forever, without losing appreciation for each moment's precious uniqueness. Outside, the world continued its ancient patterns of birth and death, joy and sorrow, connection and separation. But inside Thorne Manor, time moved differently, not faster or slower, but deeper, in rhythm with hearts that had learned to beat in harmony. When someone offers you forever, Marion thought as Lord Thorne's hand found hers in the darkness, the price isn't what you give up. The price is having the courage to believe you deserve it. And looking around at her extraordinary family, she knew they had paid that price gladly.